This presentation mirrors and echoes exploring parallel process in coaching supervision. Little introduction. First of all, why this one? Well, first of all, welcome, I've done that, but why this particular topic? Well, it's something I've noticed that supervisors are aware of theoretically, but I often see it being neglected in practice. And I suspect that's because it feels rather theoretical versus practical. And what I'd love to do today is get to the point where not only can you start conceptualizing parallel process, but if you're not confident with it, you can start to tease your way into it. You can start just experiment and play a little bit with the idea that perhaps parallel process is a part of the supervision space that perhaps you're involved with. It might not be, and that's something I'm going to talk about as well, the tendency to over-identify parallel process. But nonetheless, having assessed a number of particularly newer supervisors, I do notice a tendency to miss parallel process, or even if they spot it, to kind of gloss over it because they're not like they don't know the entryway. They're not quite sure what's the doorway they need to walk through. So that's the reason why this one is today's session. Briefly, who am I? I'm Nick Bolton. I'm the founder of the International Centre for Coaching Supervision, which I founded in 2020, and Animas Centre for Coaching, which was when was that? 2008. Blimey, it's a long time ago. So I've been a coach now since early 2000s, and very much of the existential orientation. That's pretty much where I come from. Most of my adult life has been looking at how do people live life in terms of how their paradigm meets the world as it is, and then how do they react to that and respond to that. Very briefly, a 1 hour long session. I've talked about that already. And quick reflection. Let me get some thoughts from you. I'm going to quickly unshare my screen. What does parallel process currently mean to you? If you could just put in the box there, what does parallel process mean to you? And if you don't know, just put no idea. That's absolutely fine. And while you're doing that, I'm going to make one of my team a co-host, which will be very useful. There we go. So Jen, you are now co-host. So let's take a look. Comments coming through. Yep, done that, Ruth. It means me feeling something in parallel to my client and because of what they're sharing with me. Wonderful. Okay. Thank you, Shirley. Anyone else? I know it's quite a big question, so you're probably typing, and I need an answer now. No, don't worry. No pressure. No pressure. Don't feel the parallel process coming from me. It's okay. Any other comments coming? Replication of something you are seeing. Okay, great. Similar things playing out at the same time. Okay. What's happening over here is also happening over there. In other words, we might be participating in the pattern that's playing out the client's world. Great. Something replicated. Okay, great. Thank you so much. That's good. So it's really good to see there's a certain degree of awareness in the room. And maybe some of you are sort of thinking, I don't really know. I'm looking for clarification. And some of you are thinking, blimey, this guy's going to teach me to suck eggs. I know all this stuff. And hopefully you'll get some value from it. So what we're going to cover is really get into grips with what is parallel process. We'll take a look at the psychodynamic lens as it relates to parallel process, and then the systemic lens as it relates to parallel process, and then look at how you can work a parallel process in practice. Oops. Oh, the one other part I should have put there, which is really how you link the psychodynamic and systemic. If any of you came to my last talk on the formative, normative, restorative functions, you'll know that one of my key themes was they don't work in silos. All three of them are always at play in some way together. And it's the same with this. For me, you don't think, it's psychodynamic or it's systemic. Both can play at the same time in parallel process. And I really want to kind of explore how that can happen. So let's get clear on what parallel process is first and foremost, or at least my interpretation of it. You could certainly have a completely different version, but this is how I see it. Joan, I'm assuming you're going to admit people as they come through, if that's okay. So parallel process in coaching supervision refers to the unconscious replication or mirroring of relational dynamics across the client-coach-supervisor relationship. Let me read that again. Parallel process in coaching supervision refers to the unconscious replication or mirroring of relational dynamics across the client-coach-supervisor relationship. It occurs when the emotional tone, interaction patterns, or systemic influences present in the coaching relationship are unconsciously carried into the supervision space, or vice versa. That's something that people often forget, actually. There's a form of parallel process, which can be a very constructive one, which If you just put yourself on mute, everyone, please, that'd be great. Thank you. Yeah, there's a very constructive form of parallel process where the dynamic within the supervision relationship is replayed in the coaching relationship in a more functional manner. In other words, the supervisor can role model maybe a more courageous conversation, a more phenomenological conversation, a more clean conversation, an adult to adult conversation, whatever it might be, that the coach either learns from very consciously or unconsciously replicates in the coaching space. So that can be a very useful, deliberate use of parallel process going the opposite direction. So hopefully that as a basic concept is relatively clear. Fundamentally, parallel process is where something is unconscious, but it's causing a set of behaviors or relationship dynamics within the supervision space that's aping, copying what's happening elsewhere. Now, by the way, that can also happen in what they call reverse, or I'm not sure what the opposite of reverse is, reverse or straightforward. In other words, we'll get to this in more detail shortly, but let's imagine the energy that's being percolated through as one of anxiety. It could be the supervisor that feels anxiety, which would be a straightforward parallel process, but it could be the supervisor feels annoyance at the anxiety. In other words, there's a sort of like reverse reaction to it, but we'll get to that in a little bit more detail. Well, I see Anima is just entering the room, so welcome, Anima. Years ago, I did a book called Picturing Coach Supervision. It's still available on the ICCS website, completely free of charge. And it's basically 50 illustrations of supervisory themes. And this was one of them, which is parallel process. And you can, a very simplified form of parallel process. There's the client saying, just tell me on his shirt. There's the coach. Then the coach goes to the supervisor and just tell me and replicates it. Now, what I was saying about reverse a minute ago is that it could be the supervisor does the opposite and says, just tell me. Now, that's an unlikely one with that particular example, but it could be the supervisor adopts the client's behavior so that in the end, the coach is getting it from both sides, but that's a form of reverse parallel process. Now, the origins, very briefly, of parallel process were from the psychoanalytic tradition, and in particular from a chap called Harold Searles in 1955, who recognized that through the process of transference and countertransference, they could start to work on psychoanalytic relationships by noticing what's happening in this space as reflecting what's happening in that space. And so Harold Searles was the first person to use, that I'm aware of at least, to use the term parallel process. So that's the sort of origin of it. But since then, it then began to be used in psychoanalytic supervision more fully, and then eventually now the concept of parallel process is pretty much widespread through most relational supervision. Notice I say relational supervision. I'm not talking there about managerial supervision, relational supervision, whether that's coaching, mentoring, supervision, maybe other forms of transformative dialogue and so on. Okay, so we know what it is. We know where it's come from. Woohoo! How's it useful? What do we actually do with it? What's the point of it? What's the point in noticing it? Can't we just say, let's manage that away. Let's just get that out of the room. Well, the reason why it's useful I mean, this is just a non-exhaustive list, but it certainly covers a lot of the good stuff. One of the first things that can help is to break the grip of unhelpful client patterns. In other words, by feeling the pattern yourself as a supervisor, you can notice the pattern that the client is in through that system and help the coach identify and break it. Sometimes the client's pattern can be unseen by the coach, and by replicating in the supervision space, it enables us as a working dyad, coach and supervisor, to help the coach and coachee, client, to notice it and begin to break it. So it brings it into sharp focus. And we'll talk about Jung's very, very famous quote about, what's not brought to consciousness becomes destiny. So it also helps the supervisor and coach avoid getting entangled in dynamics they don't own. This is, for me, one of the biggest ones. It's kind of amazing how quickly we can get trapped by certain feelings, patterns, dynamics that we think, why is that happening? Why am I behaving like this? Once we start to realize that perhaps there's something else going on that's beyond the immediate relationship, we can start to step out of it and look at it together. I remember when I trained as a supervisor, the phrase was, get off the dance floor and get onto the balcony. If we can get off the dance floor of the relationship and get onto the balcony, looking down at the relationship, all of a sudden we can start to really look at, well, what are we being entangled in and how do we unentangle ourselves so that we work more effectively and then begin the process of noticing what this might actually be about. As a result of that, hopefully, it creates more space and choice in the supervisory and coaching relationship. In other words, once we notice these things, we can start to say, well, what should we do about this? What do we need to change in our relationship or in what we're working on, or what actions you take? It increases psychological safety and supervision because what becomes unconscious becomes conscious and becomes addressed. And that creates an amazing space. I remember years ago having a situation where I used to turn up late to this supervision session every time. I was the supervisor, by the way, super, super unprofessional. But there was something going on for me where I just used to really not look forward to the session. And we ended up having a really beautiful conversation around what was really going on between us that meant I was coming late. It wasn't that I was busy. It wasn't that, oh my goodness, I was busy. It's like, no, I was resisting. But actually, that created a greater psychological safety because we had the honesty and the courage to have this conversation around what was I holding back for? Why was I not showing up? And what was I experiencing that made it an unpleasant supervisory relationship for me? And it really ended up becoming a much more constructive journey we went on and a much more honest conversation. It brings clarity to stuck or confusing coaching sessions. And as much as, a lot of coaches will be like, "Wait, why is that happening? Why is the client doing this? Or why am I feeling this?" And once you start to see that it's part of a system, you can start to address it. And it brings a lot of confidence actually to coaches once they understand that it's not them or it's not the client. It enhances systemic awareness and again, enhances choice as a result of that. Once you start to see that, hey, this isn't all about me or my client, it's about the system this is a part of. It can create a great deal of choicefulness and also more, again, more sort of, what would you say, a kind of confidence in your ability. You're no longer, you cease to beat yourself up, let's say. And then finally, can strengthen the coach's self-awareness and authority and the supervisor's confidence and presence. So essentially, it's a pretty good set of wins all around if you can start to really not only identify parallel process, but begin to work with it. We'll start with three little vignettes. And we're just going to lay the foundation with these three, and then we'll come back to them later. But here's one example. Vignette one, the overwhelmed coach. Client is overwhelmed, scattered, jumps from subject to subject, and doesn't seem to make any progress. Now, no doubt as coaches, none of you have experienced that before. I'm sure all of your clients are super well organized, get everything done, hit all their goals, never say they haven't done something, and so on. But they do exist, these clients. The coach then in turn finds that they are rushed in the supervision. They're always switching topics. They themselves seem stressed and anxious, and they seem to rarely implement ideas that come from supervision, even though the ideas might be fantastic, even though they might have had the most amazing epiphany during the supervision. Somehow it doesn't get fed through into practice. And then finally, the supervisor themselves feels scattered and pressured and have an urge to sort out the mess. So that's vignette one. We'll come back to this. Number two, the resistant dynamic. In this case, the client avoids responsibility, doesn't believe anything can make a difference, feels disempowered by his company. The coach, in turn, feels frustrated with the client, feels that she is not being useful to the client, and also wants the client to own his stuff. I've said that politely, own his stuff. And then finally, the supervisor, sorry, not supervisee, rejects the supervisor's, oh, no, that's correct. Hold on a second. I'm a bit mad there. The quote feels that way. As the supervisee, they reject the supervisor's suggestions, get frustrated at the supervisor's focus on the supervisor's focus on their feelings. Now, the supervisor in turn can also then start to feel frustrated with the client, with the supervisee. So they're not being useful, want the coach to sort out the stuff, and so on. And then finally, the organizational echo. The client defers to authority. Always remember reading a fantastic chapter by Nick Smith in the Peter Hawkins book. It was called The Deference Threshold, and it's a really, really worthwhile chapter to read if you can get hold of it. It's actually in one of the very, very old editions of, I think it's Supervision in the Health Professions, or it might be the consultancy one they did. But anyway, it's a really, really great chapter, but it got deleted from one of the later editions for some weird reason. But it's, the idea that you have a deference threshold can really kick in. So in this case, the client defers to authority, worries about his job, wants to please everyone. The coach in turn is hesitant, deferential in the supervision, asks what's the best approach and am I doing something wrong? And the supervisor feels annoyed. Now I know none of you would feel this, but the supervisor in this case has a sense of superiority. Like if I was in that position, I wouldn't be doing that. And wants to tell the coach to get a grip of the situation. So just hold those three in your mind, and we'll come back to those and look at them through the parallel process lens. Now, the good news, the theory is a lot more complex than the practice. And I think that's really important to recognize. Sometimes I think I'm a big fan of theory. For any of you who know me and you've seen my lectures on philosophical concepts within coaching, you know that I love theory. It's just part of my makeup. But theory shouldn't be difficult to implement. Otherwise, not only does it destroy the nature, the quality of the relationship you're in with a client, but it actually just makes everything way more complicated than it should be. So the theory is far more complex than the practice of parallel process. And as we get to the end of this presentation, I'll walk you through some of the most simple ways you can start to really grapple with parallel process. Finally, one other thing I want to say before we dig into some of the detail is that all that glitters is not gold. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean this. Sometimes you've got to discern parallel process. There can be a great temptation to say that if something looks like A and A looks like B, then A and B must be parallel process. But actually, sometimes it's not the case. Let me show what I mean. Some of the questions you might ask yourself is this normal for me? Let's imagine you've got a client, a supervisee, who's procrastinating, and you also procrastinate. You procrastinate all the time. That ain't parallel process. That's just two human beings that procrastinate. You've got to recognize the difference between something that's a parallel process where it's unconsciously being created by the system and something that's a natural human behavior that you both share in common. So one of the questions you can ask yourself is, does this belong here? Is there a reason why this behavior, this mood, this communication style, this whatever it is here? Does it belong in this space? And if not, that can be a good sign that it's parallel process. Does it make sense in terms of what's really going on? Sometimes you can, if you're both procrastinators and you're procrastinating, it really makes sense. It might not be effective, but it really makes sense. But if what's going on is one sort of thing and your behavior is another, it's like, well, how did these two match up? And that could be a good sign that there's something unconscious happening. Is this mine, or is it from the outside of me? If it's yours, it's probably not parallel process. But if it's from the outside of you, if you're finding it inside of you, because it's come from outside, then there's a very good chance it's parallel process. Is it just a trait we share in common? Am I looking too hard for something that may not be there? For everything I said at the start about a lot of supervisors don't use parallel process, but there are some supervisors who overuse it. In other words, they kind of see it everywhere. It's the old Gestalt idea of if everywhere, what is the phrase? If all you have is a hammer, everything's a nail. And if all you have is parallel process, everything's a parallel process. You have to be careful not to overanalyze these things. Is there actual mirroring of the supervisee-client relationship, or is it just a surface similarity? So those are just some questions to ask yourself to discern, is this really parallel process or is it something else? I had a great conversation yesterday with an internal supervisor who was saying that it's a funny thing in her world. She's an external supervisor working with an internal coaching team. And she said it's interesting because at one level inside the organization, everything becomes systemic. For them, everything's systemic. And she's on the outside looking and going, no, that's not systemic because I'm seeing it from out here, and that happens over here too. But on the other hand, they miss so many things that really are systemic. So it's almost like these blind spots of being systemic, and yet a universal kind of assumption that everything is systemic. So it's a little bit like that with parallel process. You have to be discerning what is really parallel and what's just human traits. Okay, let's get to the kind of the nub of this particular talk today, which is I want to introduce the concept, or not so much introduce, but at least talk about the concept of the two ways we can think of parallel process. And one is psychodynamic and one is systemic, and they're different and yet related. So if we think about the psychodynamic forces that create parallel process, we can kind of think of them in a number of ways. The first one, and this is what led to the idea of parallel process becoming known in 1955, or at least theorized in 1955, is transference and countertransference. So in this situation, let me at least offer a definition, then we'll talk about how it relates to parallel process. But transference is when a client transfers onto the practitioner, that could be the supervisor or the coach, a significant figure from their world. Now, typically, from a psychodynamic perspective, that's typically been a figure from their childhood. But nowadays, we can also think of any significant character as impacting that person. You might transfer your boss onto the coach, or transfer the boss onto the supervisor, etc. In other words, it doesn't have to be something from childhood. Theoretically, that's where it starts, but it's about finding kind of, if you like, avatars that probably reach back into the childhood, but nonetheless can be a current figure too. So when the client, or say the coachee to the, or the coach to the supervisor, is transferring somebody from their life onto that person, that's transference. When the supervisor is transferring somebody from their life onto the coach, or the coach is doing something, transferring something onto the client, that's counter-transference. That's the basic definition. Transference is one way, counter-transference is the other way, but they're both essentially the same psychodynamic function, which is to take a character out here and put it here. Now, the reason why that's significant to, you can probably guess straight away, why it's significant to parallel process is because people are being brought into that space that don't belong there. And that can start to create forces and dynamics and patterns that start to, if you think about TA, if somebody's coming into that space in a childlike position, they're going to potentially trigger the parent state, parent ego state of the other person. Unless that person has the ability to stay grounded in adult, they might even trigger a fellow child. It could be two children that start playing together, or two parents that just spend all the time criticizing the system they're part of, and we know better. Either way, once transference or counter-transference comes into play, it can create these unseen forces that start parallel process moving. Then we have projective identification. And this is somewhat like transference and counter-transference, but has a sort of a stronger force. And I'm going to show you a couple of you call illustrations in a minute that will kind of hopefully bring this home memorably. But projective identification is when the client projects onto the, I'm just gonna focus on the coach and the supervisor, otherwise it gets all too confusing. When the coach projects onto the supervisor unconsciously a quality that they are rejecting in themselves. All right, so let me say that again. The coach is projecting onto the supervisor a quality that they reject in themselves, and it gets adopted unconsciously by the supervisor, who plays out that role. So to give you an example, imagine the coach really, really wants to tell the client what to do. They're just so sick of their prevarication and their slowness. And they just want to shake that client. And somehow they project that, and they don't do it. It's the shadow. It can't be done because it's against the rules and all these sort of things. So it's a shadow that's lurking inside the coach. And so the coach projects that unconsciously into the supervisor, who unknowingly adopts it. It's kind of a bit like Venom, isn't it? I don't like superhero films, by the way, but Venom just reminds me of that. It gets into the supervisor, who then starts to play out that role. So that then the supervisor starts mentally shaking the coach. And they're like, hold on a sec. Why am I shaking my coach? Why am I shaking my supervisee? This isn't me. I don't do this. This isn't my behavior. At that point, you say, does it belong to me? No. Does it belong here? No. So what is it a symptom of? And it could certainly be projective identification. Then we have displacement, where an emotion that belongs in one place is displaced into another place. Again, and by the way, these operate together. You can see this. If that emotion is one of annoyance, it belongs in the space where the annoyance exists, or it needs to be dealt with in one way or another. But instead, the annoyance finds its way into the supervision. And so you have this concept displacement, where something that belongs in one place ends up in another. And repetitive compulsion, where essentially you're replaying unresolved relational patterns throughout your life or throughout certain relationships. And this is something that a coach could easily bring into supervision, or a client could bring into the coaching relationship. That means they're constantly playing this thing. And anyone who's been educated in transactional analysis, which I suspect most of you have to some degree, will understand that this is what would be called a game with a capital G. Repetition compulsion is to have this compulsion to kind of repeat the same behaviors over and over again, because it gets a certain payoff. The Eric Burns notion of the game. Those would be some psychodynamic forces, and here's just a couple of examples of this. Is transference, where the client on the left has got a picture in her mind of some figure from her past. The coach on the right has the mask of that person over the face, because that's what she sees. That would be transference. If if you switch the coach and client labels the other direction, it would be countertransference. And then projective identification. I'm hoping this kind of brings it home. In this example here, let's call this the coach and the supervisor. The coach is handing the supervisor a rhinoceros's head. Not a real one. It was bought from a joke shop, don't worry. It's made of rubber. So she hands the supervisor this rhinoceros's head made of rubber. He puts it on, and she then says, "Help, there's a rhinoceros next to me." And he says, "Why do I feel like a rhino?" Now, that's a very, very silly illustration, but I hope it kind of brings home what projective identification is all about. He doesn't know why he's behaving like that, and she doesn't realize that she created a rhinoceros in the first place. That's projective identification. I'm going to finally talk about the containment process, and then I'm going to pause for a second to see if there are any thoughts or questions or reflections. So containment is the concept from William Bion, who talked about the whole psychoanalytic process being about containment of these forces in a way that in his case, psychoanalyst would contain those emotions and, if you like, transmute them into something more useful. And it's the same with supervision, same with coaching. The idea is the supervisor would contain these parallel processes, these forces, this transference or this projective identification. They would become aware of it, contain it, transmute it into something more useful, and enable that to have a much more constructive dynamic to the relationship. So the supervisor becomes an emotional container. They enable themselves to pause and reflect. What might this emotion belong to? And they transform that emotion into insight, whether that's through, any of you who've trained with ICCS will know the John Perrin's categories. It could be through an informative intervention, a catalytic intervention, it doesn't really matter. But somehow the supervisor will take that contained emotion and the processing that's been done, often instantaneously, and have a way to transmute that into insight. And of course, the end result of that is safety, resonance, and transformation. Now, I'm just going to put here, when have you experienced this? I don't think we have enough time to kind of go into kind of your examples, I'm afraid, but let me at least pause and see if there are any thoughts, reflections, or questions coming up. So bear with me a second. Yes, right. Let me just scroll on down. Yes, any, by the way, if you want to just raise your hand and talk, you can do, because that might be easier than writing. One new message here. I just realized I was seeing present. Oh, I see, I see. Yes, that was the right one, Beatrice. You guessed well. Any thoughts, questions, reflections, or shall I move on? No, all good? Great, okay. Thank you, Brian. I see you nodding. It's funny, isn't it, when somebody becomes figural, as the Gestaltist would say, if they become figural at Zoom, they don't even mean to. They just end up center. And that person thankfully nods at you, and you're like, good, right. I've got the result I wanted. Let me go back to my presentation. Okay, so now let's talk about systemic forces as it relates to parallel process. The kind of the ones that have been identified most commonly are roles and loyalties, feedback loops, organizational shadows, and boundary permeability. So let's go through those one at a time. Roles and loyalties, this is an interesting one. I just mentioned Gestaltists, actually, and this is a very interesting one. Roles is not the job title. A role is the psychological role that somebody has in a system. So the Gestaltists would often talk about in group work, somebody becoming figural for a certain dynamic. You're the joker in the pack. You're the one that always asks all the questions. You're the one that's difficult to deal with. You're the one that wants to be friendly with it. You're the one that makes you're the peacemaker, etc., etc. That would be the kind of role he's talking about here. It's talking about the psychological role that somebody plays and how that role can find its way through the system. Let me give you an example. Imagine a client is the compliant doer. Everyone knows. I mean, Clive came to mind, but everyone knows that Clive is the compliant doer. So when Clive comes to coaching, that would be, you would think, wouldn't you, potentially a chance to break out of that role and go, I'm not going to be the compliant doer here. But funny enough, Clive becomes the compliant doer in the coaching. So all of a sudden, Clive is doing what the coach seems to suggest. I'm sure you've all had that situation where you haven't suggested anything, but the client will say, "Oh, that's a good idea," and you're going, "What? I didn't give a good idea. I didn't say anything. I just asked a question." So all of a sudden, Clive has been a compliant doer for the coach. Now, what can happen is the coach goes into the supervision and becomes a compliant doer for the supervisor, and the supervisor's like, "Why is this person being so compliant? I've known them for a year and they've never been this compliant." Or perhaps it's a brand new relationship, but it just doesn't feel right. Something feels off. There's a compliance that doesn't feel like a collaborative level of discrimination around what's good and what's bad. It's just a compliance. That would be a classic um, role parallel process. And a loyalty parallel process you can probably sort of work out is a similar sort of thing, but it's a relational one. So who is this person loyal to within a given system, and how does that feed through? So it could be that there's an issue within a given department or a given relationship within the organization that really could be critically looked at, but doesn't get critically looked at because of the loyalties involved. And that again gets fed through. The coach finds themselves advocating for this department, for this person, for this manager. Oh, the manager's really good. It's not their fault. It's the wider system. How do they know? They don't, they're not sure. They just have this feeling. It's what they've been told. So all of this is systemic stuff coming through the system in the form of roles and loyalties. So then feedback loops is repeating dynamics. So what's happening in the organization, that's happening in the coaching, that's happening in the supervision, That could be a classic situation of people feeling rushed. A feedback loop might be something that there's a pressure to get stuff done in the organization, and that pressure to get stuff done feeds its way through into the coaching, where the client feels like, "Oh my God, I need to get results for this." The coach starts feeling they need to get results. They go to supervision, they're stressed, not getting results. They want results from the supervisor. The supervisor starts feeling the need to get results. And that's a feedback loop coming all the way through the system. It's a fairly functional thing that's happening, but it's creating this emotional dynamic through the whole system. And then organizational shadows that can run through the system. So this would be what you might think as disavowed aspects of an organization. That could be something like a sort of a nature of bullying, let's say. I was not say no, it could be bullying, but it could just be a sense of people aren't good enough. So there's a sense in which you need to be absolutely your best. And if you're not being your absolute best, you're not good enough, and we're going to get rid of you. There's a sense in which that isn't really talked about as being explicit, but it's there. And that can feed through, again, through the system as an organizational shadow. And we talked there, I said unseen, often disavowed, and these are influences. They influence the whole kind of organizational structure and ways of being. And then finally, boundary permeability. This is about how boundaries are held within systems and how do they replicate themselves in an organization. For instance, if a manager has very strict boundaries, and so their line reports are always only line reports, they're hardly human to them. They're just functional things that get stuff done. That's a very, very strong boundary. There's little permeability, and that can feed through the coaching and the supervision, where all of a sudden you find like everything just feels transactional. Everything just feels like, are we getting the job done? But on the other flip side, permeability could be very, very open. It could be, everybody's friends, we're all friends. The boss is a friend of the staff are friends of the customers, and everybody's drinking wine together. And all of a sudden that can feed through. And the supervisor, who normally has maybe quite strict boundaries or strong boundaries, suddenly finds they're being drawn into a friendship relationship. It's like, where's that coming from? So those would be systemic forces that can be feeding through. And of course, all of that stuff influences the coaching and the effectiveness of the coaching. Oh yeah. So parallel processes, I was trying to think why I typed that, but I think this is what I mean by this is, yes, what are the sorts of things that you could look at that reflect a systemic lens? And they would be things like the organizational culture. We talked just a minute ago about the shadow, but and also feedback loops. That could be a result of the organizational culture. What's it like to work there? How could that quality of what it's like to work there be feeding its way all the way up to the supervision? It could be shared or inherited values that just assumed to be correct, unspoken norms and expectations of how things are done, power dynamics, intentions and stated philosophies of the organization and how that gets adopted, systemic roles. language and narrative patterns. It's funny. I was thinking about, as I was writing this, I was thinking about years ago when I was running my business, maybe 2014. I really got into this guy called Gary Vaynerchuk. Some of you might know him. He's a entrepreneur from New York, very big. He used to be very, very big as a sort of entrepreneur's kind of like visionary in a sense. Now he's now working with the big companies like Coca-Cola. So it's sort of transcended people like me. But at the time, I really got into stuff, and you find yourself picking up his language. You know, I remember using the word predicated all the time because Gary Vaynerchuk used predicated. It wasn't like I was trying to copy him. It just sort of found its way into my brain like a little worm. But then I found my team who always used the word predicated. It wasn't a word that we'd ever used before. And I just realized, wow, it's amazing how these narrative patterns and these language patterns can influence a system without anyone becoming aware of it. So when we start to see these languages coming in, we can start to notice, is that feeding its way through the supervision system? And what does it mean to use that language? And of course, the emotional climate, is it a stress climate, relaxed climate? Are they gung-ho? Are they ambitious? Are they, whatever it might be? So these are just some of the kinds of areas you could explore. And of course, we talked about boundaries and permeability already. Wait a second, I'm just going to have a quick, let me just pause while I have a quick drink of water, see if there are any questions or thoughts coming up at this point. You could kind of think of the organizational shadow versus the feedback loop as unconscious versus conscious, let's say. So the organizational shadow is what's not known, whereas the feedback loop is people know that's how it gets done here. It's something that's happening. We know we want results quickly. What we're not seeing is that feedback loop is necessarily affecting the supervision until you become aware of it, or affecting the coaching until you become aware of it. So it makes sense. So the feedback loop is rather more functional. The organizational shadow is rather more unconscious and psychological, let's say. Makes sense. The second question. Yeah, sure. So imagine as a supervisor, you're working with somebody, everything just feels transactional. It just feels like, wow, I'm not building any relationship with this person. It just feels like we're doing a job and the job needs to get done, but there's no warmth, there's no sense of really going deep. It's like there's a process going on. It's like following the grow model. You're just doing this kind of bang, 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 bang. You're like, where is that coming from? This isn't how I work as a supervisor. So where's it coming from? And as you start to explore, you realize this sense of like tight, impermeable boundaries is part of they call it very transactional relationships with part of the organization. And it's feeding, it's all the way through to the supervision. Any other questions or are we good? Come to my figural Brian at the top there. I'm not joking. All right, let me go back to my presentation. Okay, so working with parallel process, how do we actually do it? And I said at the start that the theory is way more complex than the practice, and you'll be all very, very happy to know that because it really isn't that complex. Theory is a way to understand what's going on. It's not how to do the work. Theory is just explaining it. How we do it is often very, very simple. So let's go into it. Working with parallel process. First of all, I want to talk about integrating the two lenses because what we can think of is psychodynamic is the inner experience and systemic is the outer context, but they work in tandem. The inner, I'm going to explain this in a second, don't worry, but the inner may relay the outer and the outer may relay the inner. For instance, projective identification, which is an inner experience, may be an unconscious way of delivering an organizational shadow. It might not be that projective identification is coming from the person's personal background. It might be coming from an organizational background. So let me try to make this really clear. The coach is putting the rhino's head on the supervisor, but the rhino hasn't come from the coach's personal background. It's come from the organizational shadow. So you have a combination of the inner experience or the psychodynamic with the systemic as the cause. And likewise, a systemic force might be the result of a psychodynamic forces in key stakeholders. Again, what do I mean by that? Well, what causes systemic forces in the first place? Well, potentially the character, personality, and makeup of the key figures in that organization. You take a very classic example like Steve Jobs. Everyone knows that Steve Jobs had a very particular character which fed into the organization. You could take a psychodynamic interpretation of that as the cause. So you could say, well, there are psychodynamic forces at play here, but they show up in the system. And then that system feeds its way through the supervision. So Again, I'm going to reiterate, the theory is more complex than the practice. We don't need to really necessarily know which of these is correct. I'm just giving you the context for what can happen and where it's coming from so you can reflect for yourself. So, first of all, the first thing we need to do, go back to the point about containment. We can't contain what we don't see. Because if we're not containing it, if we're not seeing it, we can't contain it and it takes over us and we become part of the pattern. We find ourselves acting in ways that aren't conducive to effective supervision. So we need to spot the signs. First thing you can ask yourself, well, not necessarily first, but one of the things you can ask yourself is why am I feeling this? Is there an emotional resonance? And if there is, why? Where's it coming from? Is it mine? Does it belong to me or does it belong somewhere else? Then you can notice repetition of dynamics in the supervision. Like each time you work with this person, this is happening. So it's not an individual situation. It's something that's happening over and over again. Or it could be, I'm just going through a process at the moment of interviewing supervisors who work with internal coaching teams. It could be that supervisor sees the same dynamic across multiple coaches because they're all part of that same system. And then incongruence between words and tones. So maybe the words is classic ulterior transaction from transactional analysis. The words say one thing, but the tone, or what Eric Berne would call the psychological communication, is really what's going on. And so when you feel that just feels kind of weird, what's going on there? Like she's saying this, but I'm feeling that. That's a really great indication of there's potentially something going on. And then out of character behavior, either of the coach or of you, the supervisor. Why am I behaving like this? This isn't me. Now, I'll never forget years ago supervising somebody, and I found myself really kind of getting didactic and telling them what they should do. And I remember suddenly sort of catching myself, going, where's that come from? I said, I'm really sorry. I don't know why. I don't know why I suddenly started feeling like I need to teach you and tell you what to do. And it definitely caused a rupture at that point. But because I caught myself in the process, we were able to kind of work through it and come out the other end. But it was a really, like I got really, kind of instructive. It wasn't good, and it was very out of character. So that's a very good sign that there's some unconscious processes at play. By the way, let me just say this: it's a good sign, but it's not proof. It could be you had a really bad morning. It could be that you had something happen at your home. Your porridge got burnt in your pan, and now you've got to throw out this beautiful pan that's kind of all burnt. I mean, so don't assume these things are proof. They're indications, and that's going to come to how we work with this stuff in a second. Echoes in language, posture, affect. In other words, how that person is showing up. Do they have a particular posture that seems to create a superiority or inferiority or whatever it might be? Just something that's echoing through the way they show up. And then for you, TA fans, things like games and racketeering, anything that sort of smacks of a game where you feel there's a psychological underpinning to this thing and what's the payoff here and all that kind of stuff. When you feel it, there's all that classic thing. If you feel it, there's something there to look at. And Cartman's triangle, if you find yourself in a rescuer, victim, persecutor triangle, and you find yourself whizzing around it like a little electron around a nucleus, if any of those things happen, do electrons go around nucleuses? I don't think so, do they? Anyway, whatever, they go around and they go in a circle, not a triangle, but you get my point. But Karma's triangles, if you find yourself in either a victim or persecutor or a rescuer mode, it's like, what's entrapping me in this? And how do I get back to adults and start to contain all of this stuff? So let's get practical. We're in this state as the supervisor where we're feeling it all, we're noticing it all, and we've become conscious of it. If none of those are true, then you're trapped in it. But assuming you've had this ability to step out, pause, take it in, contain it, as William Byron says, then it's time to start to think, how do we actually engage with this with the supervisor? And that's where reflective dialogue comes in. So this is why I say it's easier than the theory, because it's really stuff you almost certainly do. One of the things you might do is name stuff, name the roles or name the dynamics or name whatever it is that's coming up for you, and notice this, or notice when you said this, it felt like this. This is very phenomenological. You're not interpreting at this point. You're not interpreting on their behalf, and you're not interpreting for the two of you. You're not interpreting at all. You are naming. Phenomenological approach. You're naming what you see or what you feel. Doesn't mean it's true, is what you feel. I find myself feeling this. I noticed this. It's the truth. Nobody can deny that you felt something. Nobody can deny that you notice something through the lens that you have. It might not be true, but it's what you noticed through your own lens. Once we start to name it, then it's up for grabs. It's like, I always do this motion of let's bring the person's worldview into our hands so that we can start to explore it. That's all you're doing. Let's bring what's happening into view so we can start to explore it. This is one of my favorites. Now, not everyone does this, not everyone necessarily likes doing it, but it's because I'm quite theoretical, I rather like this, and it's always served me pretty well, which is to hypothesize lightly. So naming something is to not interpret. To hypothesize is to interpret, but with the assumption that it's not necessarily true. So you're not diagnosing. You're just saying, I noticed this, da 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 da, and I'm wondering if. I'm wondering if this is actually something that's happening somewhere else in the system. I'm wondering if this is something that's happening, da 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 da, whatever it might be. You are hypothesizing. I've always used hypothesizing lightly in my coaching too. I find it's a really beautiful way to bring things to awareness that maybe wouldn't come up from that person's inner world of its own accord. Maybe the ICF would bonk me on the head for doing that, but it's always been part of my style to hypothesize lightly, such that I never assume it's true, and I always disregard it as having any significance if the client doesn't feel it in some way. And then, of course, hey, guess what? You can ask curious, open questions. Have you seen this elsewhere? Do you notice this feeling in other parts of your coaching? Do you notice it in the relationship? Have you noticed that how it surfaces in the organization you're part of, or the family system you're working in, or whatever it is that you're working in? Just open, curious questions that don't assume any diagnostic validity. You're not saying, hey, I'm an expert supervisor, and I know this is a parallel process, and I know that it's coming from a systemic perspective that's been polluted by a psychodynamic origin of the organizational shadow. No, you're doing none of that. You're just enabling the person to start to think. Now, because you're supervisors and you're working coaches as opposed to with coachees, stroke clients, there's a shared language, and you're allowed to, allowed to in the openest sense, you're allowed to do anything, let's be honest, as long as it's legal. You're at this point, you're allowed to really inform and educate your supervisee. For any of you who know the John Heron categories, where you've got the informative intervention. This is where you might say, hey, let me share a bit about this concept called parallel process. So you've named the dynamic, you've maybe hypothesized, you've asked open and curious questions. By the way, it doesn't have to be in this order. And now it might be that you say, is it okay if I share this concept called parallel process? Or is it okay if I talk about organizational shadow? Or is it okay if whatever it might be? So you start to actually use your informative intervention just to begin to broaden the conversation. I should have put that as a bullet point. I apologize. That would have been a very good bullet point. It just came into my head as I was talking. You can also use, of course, metaphors and imagery. It's never been one of my strong points to use metaphors and imageries, but you can certainly say things like, is that a classic dance one? If this was a kind of dance that we're doing together here, what sort of dance would that be? And where else do you see that dance? It's a nice way to strip it of the interpretation and just look at the dynamic. And then a really important one is to explore feelings and not just events. There is a tendency sometimes to explore the process of what's happened. In fact, my next talk, which I've just decided to do today, I planned it this evening, is called something like Now is When the Work Takes Place. And it's looking at how I4, I5, and I6 can be utilized, because that's the now moment. It's what's happening right here between us this second, as opposed to over there. So when we're talking about over there events, it can be a very good way of distancing ourselves from emotions, because the feelings are over there somewhere. When we talk about what's happening here, it's much more visceral and it's much more now. So explore feelings that come up in the moment, not just what happened in the there and then. Oops. So those are just some ways you can work with reflective dialogue. And I'm just going to conclude this little section here with bringing awareness gently, which I think is so important. Curious, non-judgmental inquiry. So to go to the question, how do you do this? Well, here's a very simple question. Does this show up anywhere else in the ... relationship, system, dynamics, etc., etc.? Don't forget, you're working with coaches, and coaches tend to understand this kind of language much more so than, say, a coachee that's not had coaching education. And then we used to talk a lot in Animas, which is my coaching school, about the subjunctive stance. And the subjunctive stance is a stance of unknowing. It always starts with, I wonder if, or maybe, or these kinds of approaches that make sure that you're not seen as knowing. If you can take a subjunctive stance, like, I wonder if, could this be, dot, 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 then it enables the client to, or the supervisee, to grapple with it without feeling like, number one, they're being pinned down, and number two, that they're being judged. And again, I mentioned there, where else might this belong? Potentially that's a leading question in some ways, but there's no perfection there. You can try these things and just see how they land. And the final one on this is respecting readiness. And I put there, timing matters. You can't just go gung-ho into parallel process. You've got to have the ability to have the relationship to be able to stand back with the supervisee. So timing really matters sometimes with this stuff. The first sight of parallel process, don't just jump in. Allow it to play out a little bit and see where it's going to take you. It's really important that you become the container first, rather than trying to contain together straight away. All right, let's come back to our friends, the overwhelmed coach, resistant dynamic, and the organizational echo. The important thing to say is, I gave you the sort of context for each of these, but it's a sort of a trick question, because in truth, any of the things we've talked about could be happening here. In my experience, there's a sort of a tendency sometimes to simplify parallel process and to think, if it's a personality thing, like they're overwhelmed, it must be X. And if it's an organizational thing, it must be Y. In fact, anything could be playing through these three case scenarios. And that's why it's really important that you're not diagnosing. You're not the one that's doing the work. The client, the supervisee, is the one that's doing the work. You're the one that's facilitating the exploration. Where does this overwhelm come from? Is it a form of psychodynamic overwhelm, in the sense that this person is kind of is being transferred upon by the client and is now transferring to you? Is it a form of organizational shadow? We don't know. It's the conversation that needs to take place. So in each of these cases, don't assume there's a right answer. There's only a dialogue. And that's the really critical thing with this work. It's a dialogue. And so just to conclude this little talk, Carl Jung famously said something along the lines of, I don't think this is his actual quote, this is a shortened version: what is not made conscious returns as faked. And so what I believe we need to do is make the unconscious conscious in this work. And so if there is something that's parallel, if there is something that's unseen, if it's unconscious, if it's feeding its way through the system and not being named, my belief is your role, one of your roles, is to see it, contain it, and then to have the dialogue with the supervisee, dialogue about what it might mean, if anything. So on that note, I'm going to pause. That's my presentation over. I'm just going to close it down and come back to you. Let me stop sharing. I'm going to come back to you as a group. So thank you so much, everyone. Let me just open it up for any reflections. What might you do with this? Are there any questions that you do want to get some factual answers to, i.e., like Anna did, just some definitional answers? Any thoughts coming up for you? Yeah, absolutely. Yes, it is correct. I'm a little ambivalent on whether it's truly personal parallel process, because it's kind of moved from the unconscious to the conscious. Where I would say it is parallel process is where it's not done deliberately. But have you heard of the concept of the internal supervisor? It's okay, so great. It's the idea that the supervisee begins to unconsciously adopt many of the mindsets or practices of the supervisor, and then they take that into their practice. That will, in a way, that would be a kind of parallel process, because it is unconscious. It's very much like an unconscious process of learning and assimilation, as opposed to deliberately role modeling as a way of teaching. So I would say that approach isn't parallel process per se, although it's super useful. The other one is much more about the internal supervisor, Brian, I would say, and that's parallel process. We often talk in supervision about the idea you carry around a little mini version of your supervisor until that mini version of supervisor becomes yourself. But at first, it's like, if I'm supervising somebody, they have a little mini Nick in their head. Or if I'm being supervised, I have a mini whoever in my head. But over time, that person morphs into my own version of myself as a supervisor. So that's the kind of the idea of parallel process in that situation. Wonderful. Well, unless there are any other thoughts or questions, I will bid you adieu. Good morning to those who are in the States, and good afternoon to those of you who are in Europe, and a good evening and a good night from those of you like me in the far east of Asia. So thank you so much, everyone. Speak to you again soon.